All right. Good afternoon slash morning to everybody. Hope you're having a great week so far. We are on Unit 8, Session 3. So, Unit 8, Session 3, we're finishing up the book of Joshua this week. And then next week, we'll be moving on to the book of Judges. And so, um, really cool part of the Bible, in my opinion. A lot of cool stories that we don't often get to hear. And so, we're finishing up Joshua. We're in chapter 23. The people of Israel are they've done a lot of conquering. The first 12 chapters of the book of Joshua are about the conquest, and then the final 12 chapters are really about the allotment of land, and it's honestly kind of boring until you get to the last chapter and you see Joshua's come to the end of his life, and he is prepared to kind of pass the baton on. If you remember a few weeks ago, we talked about, or maybe it was about a month ago, when Moses had died and he passed the baton on to Joshua. Um, there was a clear-cut leader in the form of Joshua. Now, situation is different because there isn't necessarily a clear-cut leader after Joshua leaves, and so this will be an interesting time in the nation of Israel, a really dark time, I believe, in the book of Judges, and but the message in Joshua 23 is both applicable to the people of Israel during that time, but also for us today to just take some principles on remembrance. Remembrance is something that I feel like many of us we don't do often because we live in a busy world where we continue to have to face new things every single day. But when we remember God's faithfulness and what He's done in our lives through the years, it gives us confidence in the present. And so let's just look at those few points that we have here. So in Joshua 23 verses 1 through 5, he tells us to remember God's victory. Remember God's victory. Um, this kind of idea of God's deliverance, God's victory, God's power is a big theme, especially in the book of Psalms, where you have David and many of the psalmists constantly looking back to remembering their deliverance in the past. That's so important. Like when we face trial, when we face hardship in the present, we have got to be able to look back and see how God has delivered us in the past because it's overwhelming when we begin to think about it. Right? Our situation can be overwhelming that we're facing, but then when we look at God's deliverance and how he's been faithful in the past, we'll just be overwhelmed with his goodness and his mercy and his grace towards us. And also part of what Joshua's point here is the same God that delivered us through the Red Sea and delivered us over the Jordan River and helped us conquer Jericho, or really enabled us to conquer Jericho. Like that same God is the God that you still serve today. And so just because Joshua is coming to the end of his life, it should not be the end of Israel's faithfulness. Then in verses 6 through 13, he mentions God's commands. Um, and one thing that I believe the Bible teaches, and one thing we just learned through following Jesus, is God blesses obedience. He blesses obedience. That doesn't mean that life is going to be easy, but it means that when we conform our lives to the way that the way that God has intended us to live it, we live our life in the best way, right? Again, doesn't mean we're facing the best circumstances, but what it does mean is that we are in step with Jesus. We're in step with walking with Him every single day, and our heart is right, which sets the course for the rest of our lives. And so Joshua is challenging the people to remember God's commands. Right? They're in a land where there's people that don't believe in the God of the Bible, and and there will be people trying to constantly take them and tear them apart and lead them astray from God's law. But a new leader shouldn't mean that they stray from God's law, because again, it's God that delivered them, God that enabled them, and God that has given them that law. And then finally, you've got in the last few verses, you have God's promises, remembering God's promises. Um, I love verse 14. The end of verse 14 says this. Um, it says, everything was fulfilled for you. Not one promise has failed. Not one promise has failed, right? The nation of Israel had been through a lot, but God had never failed them. Like no promise had been broken. When he said he was going to do something, he did it. And that's the truth for our lives, guys. Like Not one of God's promises he's made to us has ever failed, nor will it ever. And so one thing I think that's important for us to remember is this was a reality in the nation of Israel, but this is a daily battle for us to remember that God does keep his promises. He finishes what he begins. And guys, just start remembering all the great things that God's done in your life. And I pray that it gives you confidence in the present. Thank you guys. Hope you have a great week, and we will see you next week.